So at this point, you guys, I would like to show you the interview that Ramona Massachi and I did with Shahid Buttar. For those that don't know Shahid, he's an attorney and activist in San Francisco, and he is running for the second time against Nancy Pelosi. We talked with him about his campaign and about some MMT stuff, and it's worth noting that Sam, and we got into this a little bit, but California is an open primary state. So Nancy Pelosi constantly acting like she's running against a Republican. It's just not true. She's running against a more progressive candidate in a very progressive state and in a very progressive district within that state. So I just want you all to keep that in mind as you digest media about this race going forward. This was an absolutely fantastic interview. If you're interested in getting involved in Shahid's campaign, check the link below in the description box. I've put his website and his Twitter handle, and it'll also be up on the screen throughout the interview. So if you're interested in volunteering, if you happen to be in San Francisco, or if you're interested in phone banking or texting, please go to his website. And if you can donate, please go to his website as well. We absolutely need to get rid of Pelosi. And I genuinely, you guys, I wouldn't say this to you I didn't. I think he has a serious chance of beating her this year. A serious chance. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but he's got a chance, and we all have to do our part to make it happen, right? So this is Shahid Buttar joining Ramona Massachi and myself a couple of days ago to discuss his campaign. I am thrilled to be back with another candidate for our candidate segment with Ramona Massachi. We're here today with Shahid Buttar, who is obviously running against Nancy Pelosi for her House seat in California. Shahid, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Luke. It's great to be with you and Ramona.
So I was hoping you could maybe just... Yes, hello is all around. I was hoping you could start by just give the people a little bit about your background. Who are you? How'd you get into politics? What inspired you to run for this seat yet again? And what's your background like?
Thank you so much for asking. I'm an immigrant and a constitutional lawyer. I'm an artist and a grassroots organizer, and I've spent the last 20 years as a policy advocate, as a nonprofit leader, as a community organizer, both in San Francisco and in Washington, D.C., as part of a series of successive progressive movements. I was part of the Occupy movement. I was part of the movement to stop the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Before that, I sort of came out of the anti-globalization movement of the 90s. And having been a part of every progressive social movement of the last generation, from that era through the Ferguson uprising, through the George Floyd uprising, to have been a part of those struggles from the street to the courts, I have witnessed for entirely too long the failures of Democrats to stand up for their stated principles. And that's why I'm running to replace the leader of the corporate Democratic Party. I remember an era in US history when Democrats stood for things like basic human rights to healthcare and housing and food. I'm thinking of the Second Bill of Rights that FDR envisioned. And that's the vision that brings me to politics. I'm particularly eager to restrain the Pentagon and the military industrial complex. I see it as a human rights abuse engine for not just human rights violations in other countries, but when we think about the interconnection between militarism, racism, and consumerism, as Dr. King warned us, it leads straight to the climate crisis. And I do see the climate catastrophe as the proof positive that, as he warned us, injustice anywhere would be a threat to justice everywhere. And so I'm here to heed his warning and to do everything that we can to guard justice in the economic sphere, justice in the racial sphere, and justice particularly in the climate intergenerational sphere, and eager to offer San Francisco a better choice for the future.
Yeah, 100%. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to run against Pelosi, and maybe just give the audience a general description of the differences in your positions? What differentiates you from her, and why do you think she needs to go, and why do you think you would be a better representative than Nancy Pelosi?
The reason I'm running against Pelosi in particular is because she is the voice elected to the House of Representatives from the city I live in. So there's no particular strategy beyond just wanting my city to be better represented. In terms of the contrast, we could go on for this all day, but let's start maybe at the beginning. At the moment, Nancy Pelosi is taking a lot of appropriate heat for having, for decades, embraced congressional insider trading, basically filling her pockets at the expense of both the legitimacy of the marketplace and the legitimacy of congressional policymaking to be free from corporate influence, and the corruption of both the marketplace and Congress at the same time through this open, unapologetic, continuing corruption that has been longstanding for years. embodied in the poster child of the leader of the Democrats in the House, to me is disqualifying. I see this as just straight up open corruption. No, there's no way to mitigate that. Now, frankly, the corruption in Washington that Pelosi represents has many dimensions, many layers that compound each other. What we're talking about at the moment is the systemic corruption of Congress, demonstrated by the individual corruption of a particularly spectacularly wealthy dynastic oligarch. So Pelosi herself is the daughter of an East Coast political dynasty. She won her seat in 1987 to a special election, has not debated a challenger since 1987. And how different is the world today than it was in 1987? And how many people get to go 34 years without a job evaluation? And I see in particular the last 34 years characterized by a series of through threads. The first one is recurring wars for profit that she has supported at every turn. Another one is a sustained crisis in mass incarceration and domestic predatory policing, of which she has been an architect. The rise of mass surveillance, constitutional violations en masse, which she has also supported at every conceivable turn. We're living through a pandemic. Nearly a million Americans have died. The nonprofit group Public Citizen has documented that a third of those deaths could have been prevented if we in the United States simply had the same basic right to healthcare as do the citizens of every industrialized country on planet Earth. But here in the United States, where we are uniquely denied a right to healthcare by figures including Nancy Pelosi, who refuses to even allow a floor vote to proceed on the House, yet another demonstration of corporate priorities displacing the vital needs of the public. And I support not only Medicare for all and establishing a human right to healthcare free at the point of service, I would also like to establish human rights to at least subsistence levels of housing and food as basic human rights. They are, in fact, human rights in other countries. And when they tell us in the United States that other people hate us for our freedoms, we should recognize that we have fewer freedoms than other people. And when we sing anthems at baseball games about living in a land of the free and the home of the brave, we should recognize that those are aspirational statements that in no way describe the country that we live in or have lived in. This is a land of the police and the prison slaves. That's what we live in the United States, and we should be real about it. And if we acknowledge our history and its frankly devastating failures that have their hands around the neck of the present and will kick the future off a cliff if we don't carve a different path, that's ultimately why I'm running for Congress, and to offer San Francisco a choice that favors climate justice, a choice to end student debt and cancel it. I favor not only increasing the federal minimum wage to $15, but beyond that to $25 an hour to match the increases in productivity growth. I'm eager not only to secure the Green New Deal, but to go beyond that by nationalizing the fossil fuel sector and taking off the table the profit motive that incentivizes the calamitous corporate plunder of scarce, non-renewable natural resources. I'm eager to shrink the Pentagon. I'm especially eager to contain and ultimately dismantle the NSA and the CIA, the three-letter agencies that have been laying waste to human rights, both here within the United States and around the world for generations. And I'm eager to address the needs that emerge in the future and to help our country make some better choices.
Ramona?
Right on. So can you tell me a little bit about your district? So I have a lot of friends that I used to live in New York. So I have a lot of friends that moved from New York to San Francisco, and they couldn't afford living in San Francisco anymore. So they moved to Oakland. And so is Oakland also part of your district?
It is not. Oakland is just across the bay. It is increasingly the site of the culture that people used to associate with San Francisco, as frankly, the capital from New York and other places is shifted San Francisco pretty dramatically in the last generation, particularly demographically, through precisely the dynamic you described, the vagaries of the housing market. And it's worth digging in here. Housing in the United States, like healthcare, is treated by our policy apparatus as a commodity. It's a pretext, an excuse for someone or some corporation to make a buck, as opposed to a basic human need to which everyone has access. We have, for instance, a very visible challenge with homelessness in San Francisco, and there are more empty units in the city than there are unhoused people on our streets. Tens of thousands of people need shelter every night here, and there are tens of thousands of empty spaces in which they could be, but they're not, because those spaces, of course, are prioritized for someone to make a buck. And this is a perfect example of capitalism undermining and preempting human rights, basic human rights. Every day in the United States, somebody is dying from exposure so that other people can make money from real estate speculation. And that is an absolutely senseless choice. In the same way, just to connect those two issues, the leading cause of homelessness is medical debt. So we are talking about prioritizing not just the profit making in the real estate industry, but pharmaceuticals as well, healthcare delivery, health insurance particularly. And we're prioritizing all of those industrial complexes before the public. And our district here in San Francisco feels it particularly acutely. Just to delineate the contours of the district, it's just San Francisco, nothing beyond it, and not even all of the city. Jackie Spears district carves into the sort of southwestern quadrant, let's say. So it's just the most progressive parts of the nation's most progressive city, which happens to have been represented for 34 years without a debate by a dynastic oligarch, constraining and impeding every progressive priority and defending the corporate center from the ongoing challenge by the left that I represent and am eager to take to Washington on my city's behalf.
So that kind of pulls me into the question I wanted to ask next, and that's politically. And please correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm a Seattleite and I don't know your district all too terribly well, but it does seem like it's a very progressive area, and it seems like people maybe share your politics somewhat broadly. And while I know labels can be a little bit dubious, I'm just confused by the lack of traction for progressive politics in San Francisco and the stability that Pelosi has been able to maintain throughout her term, despite her very obviously, especially as of the last couple decades, not being anything remotely close to progressive. I'm just curious what your thoughts are and where that disconnect might be.
Thank you. There's a couple different layers. One of them is the party patronage network, which is profoundly influential. This is a one-party city, and any one-party city begets corruption. You can see that across the country. A further problem here and attendant to that is the press. So if the public had an opportunity to evaluate the candidates and the choices before it and knew the record of the incumbent, I'm quite confident that our city would have made a different choice a long time ago. But Pelosi's record in office is actively obscured by journalists who have an ethical commitment to inform the public. That's why journalism exists as a fourth estate, to enable, among other things, government transparency. But when Pelosi gets away with, for instance, claiming publicly that her opponents are Republicans when she's running against a Democrat, or when she gets away with ducking debates for 34 years, or trading inside stock and putting her stock portfolio before the public interest without reporters ever asking her questions. Let's be clear about this. The recent controversy about congressional insider trading was sparked by a journalist finally showing up for work. I mean, it's not like we don't have journalists, but where have these questions been? It was never okay. Right. And it infected all kinds of policy processes in the past. And it's not like we haven't been calling that out for years. The movement's been calling this out for much longer than I've been running for office. And this has just been open, outright, unapologetic, ongoing corruption. And again, I'm grateful that the controversy is finally emerging. If the public knew the half of it, even that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? What people are responding to generally in this controversy is the corruption of the marketplace. Pelosi says that it's a free market. Members of Congress should have a chance to participate in it, conveniently overlooking that the market is not so free when she and her colleagues have unique access to information. But the corporate corruption of the policymaking process is so many layers worse than that. And the political culture, frankly, has yet to seize on that at all. And we can see that influence in every conceivable sphere. There was a Princeton study a few years ago which documented that Congress and the policymaking outcomes that emerged from it in no way correlate with public opinion. They correlate very tightly with Wall Street interests. This is why. Because policymakers have divided loyalties. They have conflicts of interest, and disclosure's not enough, right? Why do we allow corporate executives, why do we allow members of Congress to do what we disallow corporate executives and their families to do when members of Congress can do so much more damage to the public interest, right? The corruption, the self-insulation, the self-enrichment at the public's expense by powerful legislators on both sides of the political duopoly is an object of concern for me, and I think a great many Americans, and I hope that it unites us across our various tribes, because tribalism is part of the problem right now. We are living, and my candidacy is less an expression of a political goal or motive than a constitutional one. And I am mounting a constitutional challenge to a corrupt system in Washington on behalf of we the people of the United States in San Francisco. And while I do represent a particularly coherent and forceful vision of law and policy from the left, the thing that forces me to run for Congress as a powerless immigrant against an oligarch is the constitutional need to hold a system accountable that will continue to run amok with too many human beings and communities under its treads if we don't do something about it.
Absolutely. And before I pass it to Ramona here, can I just note that one of my favorite Freudian slips ever is you conflating corporate executives with congressional members, because that was just too spot on. That was absolutely hilarious. Ramona, can you please?
I noticed that as well. That's why I was laughing. So you ran against Pelosi last election cycle. How many votes did you get?
We won 81,000 votes in November 2020. It was more than any challenger that Pelosi has ever faced in the 34 years that she's held the seat. It was more by far, frankly. The closest anybody came to that was 15 years ago. And we beat the previous record by 30% in the middle of a pandemic when we couldn't knock on doors, facing a corporate media whiteout and orchestrated character assassination fabricated by the Democratic Party. In the face of all of those headwinds, we scored 81,000 votes. And as the facts emerge, both about the party's corruption and Pelosi's corruption and the policy records of the incumbent in mind that the press have tried to obscure, I'm quite confident that we can build on that 81,000 votes and mount not only a credible challenge to the seat enough to force more policy victories as we already did. That's the biggest thing in 2020. I know we can come back to that, but we shifted Pelosi on half a dozen policy issues. But not only do I aim to repeat that play and help enable reforms to pass through the House of Representatives that she would otherwise block, but I'm ultimately interested in ending her dynasty and preventing the feudal aristocratic inheritance of a congressional seat by a powerful, wealthy white family.
You just briefly, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but can you make sure the audience understands you are an open primary state? Do I have that correctly?
Yeah. Open
so the framing that she's against a Republican is very disingenuous. Can you just briefly talk about that dynamic?
Thank you. Yeah. So the structure here, not only do we have an open primary, but it's a jungle primary, meaning it's a top two primary in which all of the party's candidates run against each other in a single election, and the top two vote getters advance to November. So in 2020, I became the first Democrat other than Pelosi to win the primary here. And so I became the first Democrat to face her in a November election in November 2020. And so when she claims that she's fighting Republicans, she does nothing of the sort. And even when she claims that she's doing it in Washington, that's more theatrical than real. You know, tearing up a speech of a fascist president who she invited to give a speech in Congress at her own behest is frankly weak sauce. And passing his military budget and signing the bill that funded his concentration camps and expanding his surveillance powers and his corporate trade authority, all while claiming to fight him, is more than a little disingenuous. And it takes, frankly, a profound abdication, I dare say sustained, widespread, ongoing failure by the press establishment to construct a cult of personality around a conservative oligarch and fool the public into thinking that she's a lion of the left. Pelosi has a reputation that in no way matches the facts or the record. And ultimately, I pay too much attention to the facts to sit on my hands. And I've watched the train wreck of the last 20 years in slow motion, having done everything possible from the streets to Congress without a seat and the courts to try to stop it. And I see, when we look at Pelosi in particular in this city, this is a point worth noting. It's a little bit beyond your question, but when I look at San Francisco and Washington, our city has one of the heaviest footprints of any city in the nation's capital. San Francisco sent to DC the Speaker of the House, the Vice President of the United States, and a senior U.S. Senator in Dianne Feinstein. We also sent to Sacramento the Governor of California. This city doesn't even have 1 million people. Find me a city under 1 million people that has that kind of representation in Washington. Cities 10 times our size don't have that kind of weight in Washington. And this is, to the point that you were asking before, the nation's most progressive city. This was a beacon of the free speech movement 2 generations ago. It was a home of the anti-war movement. And then the generation that I was radicalized a generation ago, it's been a leading epicenter for climate justice and regenerative agriculture. It was a beacon for inclusion of LGBTQ communities that Pelosi also has long abandoned and yet still gets support from. I should riff on this really quick. I was one of the first advocates in the country in the legal arena to establish marriage equality for same-sex couples. I helped fight for the right for families to form whatever the choices of the adults. And when I see in Pelosi's credit from the gay community, which she did not support in that fight for another decade after I was fighting for those principles, she showed up for marriage equality on the eve of a decision by the Supreme Court, but she never fought for it with all of the power and privilege that she had at that. She was the Speaker of the House before that and could not be called on either to stand up for San Francisco's LGBT communities or, for that matter, any of our other communities. San Francisco, this speaks a little bit to one of Ramona's questions earlier about the composition of the district. We've sustained one of the most intense and transformative gentrification waves of any city in the country. The racial composition of San Francisco has changed dramatically in the last generation. Our city had as many as 12, 13% African-American residents a generation ago. We're down to 4%. And that's driven largely by the housing regime. Nancy Pelosi is a wealthy landlord, and she has long impeded any number of reforms to make it easier for renters to get by. Like, for instance, the Cancel Rents and Mortgage Act that Ilhan Omar proposed after the pandemic set in, which would have forced banks to pay the cost of housing. And Pelosi, just like Medicare for All, would not let the bill proceed. And how different might the priorities for Democrats be if they weren't led by a mega millionaire oligarch putting her stock portfolio before the needs of her constituents with the assistance of a press too complicit to observe the facts? And I know I keep returning to that theme, but it's just one that I have a hard time looking past. And I see so many people in the political sphere defer to this open corruption with demonstrable policy impacts as if we don't see them painfully every day.
So Pelosi had told everybody that she was going to retire, and then she changed her mind.
Not quite, but go on. I'll
go ahead. Tell me, how did it actually, because that's what I saw. So tell me the inside.
She never promised to retire. And this is another thing that drove me mad. So many people in the political apparatus have expected her to retire for not any good reason. And I wish I were proven wrong more often, frankly. But this is not the first time I've watched Washington sort of fall asleep at the switch, and San Francisco too, for that matter. She promised to pass the gavel in a previous session as a condition to get the squad support for her to serve as the speaker. Now, the conventional wisdom is, once you've been the speaker, why would you step into the back bench? So if she promised to pass the gavel, that must mean she's retiring. And that's just a vast leap that requires ignoring a whole bunch of things. First of all, her power does not inhere in the gavel. Yes, she is the Speaker of the House, but her power inheres from her fundraising prowess and the fact that she uses it both as a carrot and as a stick. She's an enforcer of corporate rule across the party. That's where her power comes from. It's not the gavel. So she can pass the gavel, retain all of the power, and none of the accountability. She's not a powerful orator. She doesn't inspire people. She's an enforcer. That's a much stronger mode of power wielded from the shadows. So for her to give up the gavel, if anything, could make her stronger. Moreover, and this is the gloss that I think it just drives me insane how much people can pay attention and ignore the obvious. It has been an open secret in San Francisco, now reported in the press by the LA Times, by CNN, by Politico, that should Pelosi be allowed to retire in office, her plan is going to be to put her daughter in her seat in a special election in the same way that she herself won office 34 years ago and has not shown up for a debate since. Like, I don't even, and people pretend that elections are like choices between personalities. Like, I don't, it's not about me, to be honest with you, as much as I am eager to serve in Congress. The career of it, I have absolutely no interest in. It's why I'm running against the most powerful member, right? It's the principle and the policy of it. And I see the idea of a dynastic transition as open feudal aristocracy. As an immigrant, it offends me. And as a constitutional lawyer, it offends me for independent but similar reasons. No American should be okay with wealthy families handing out congressional seats to their wealthy kids as if they're like yet another mansion on their string of real estate properties. Like that's not how democracy is supposed to work. But here's the kicker. The only way it works is if voters show up. And the reason I'm offering an alternative to my city, frankly, is because no one in the Democratic Party has the cojones to do it. And when I look at the needs of the future, we can't afford to defer to the past. And I see convenience eclipse principle in too many places, and her, prevarication about her own plans has been a part of that. For the last several years, people have been asking her if she's going to retire, and she keeps pushing back. And the reason she's been pushing back was to keep heavyweights off the field so that her daughter would have a clearer shot at the seat. And I think ultimately her announcement that she's running for re-election in this cycle is because she perceives me to be a smaller threat than the establishment actors who would run in her wake if she did choose to retire and allow her daughter to face a transparent, actual, legitimate election against everyone. So you might think of this as, I'm running up the steepest hill in politics. I'm kind of like David confronting Goliath. And I recognize that, and I'm here for it because we cannot abandon tough struggles. I've never abandoned tough struggles. When I fought for marriage equality in 2004, that wasn't easy. And people didn't support us then either, but we won, and I'm grateful for it, even if that community, frankly, got de-radicalized and sort of co-opted by the establishment as a result of it. That's a whole other conversation we could have sometime. But I see in her plans and her refusal to retire and allow the future to govern itself, I see in that decision the attempt of the past to entrench itself despite its failures. And we, in the present, and people who don't yet have a chance to vote, they are the ones who are going to be forced to bear the brunt of these decisions. And it's all the more reason why we can't defer to power.
Yeah, absolutely. Just quickly to build off of what Ramona was asking about there, even if her daughter were to replace her specific seat, my understanding is the favorite to replace her as speaker would be Hakeem Jeffries, and he doesn't seem to be a whole lot more progressive than her by my perception. So I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about how the party kind of maintains itself in this way, and how that power structure is self-sustaining, even if we are actually even if you're able to beat her, then the leadership seat comes up for an election, and we get into a whole different discussion.
Right. And I'll give maybe two sides of this discussion. First, to your point, corruption is institutional. It's beyond any individual office. So when I talk about Pelosi's individuated corruption through the lens, for instance, of congressional insider trading, right, or covering up the CIA torture scandal, like that's an individual layer of corruption that stands in for and insulates a deeper institutional rot. And so we can change the figureheads, and the institutional rot remains. Because these are institutional interests. You might think of this also as attendant to the co-optation of the Democratic Party by corporate capital. Corporate capital will find other faces when people, for instance, voice and direct their frustrations at Senator's Mansion and Cinema. They often overlook the extent to which they are basically convenient rotating villains constructed by Wall Street and its enablers in Washington to take the fall on any given policy issue. They rotate the villains so that nobody ends up taking the heat. This is it's kind of like a cross between a gang, a racket, and just a very elaborate ruse being played on the public by policymakers from both sides of the political aisle. There's a lot of places to take this. So maybe I'll just leave it at there, but I'll try to come back to it in the next question.
I would call it like a mafia, because that's kind of how they proceed. So getting back to your district. So a lot of people have left your district because they can't afford to live there. So who's in your district now? Who are the people that you're trying to reach that are in your district now? And who are the people that you can't reach in your district now? Tell me the demographic.
So San Francisco skews much wider than the rest of the country. It skews both more affluent. On the one hand, we have the densest concentration of millionaires and billionaires in the country, alongside one of the worst per capita demonstrations of the failures of our housing market in the ubiquitous presence of our unhoused community. We have tent encampments all through the city, large ones, and it's a reflection of the failure of a system, particularly a system that is channeling wealth upward, and has, particularly in the last 2 years during the pandemic. We have a district that includes substantial numbers of Chinese American community members and Spanish-speaking community members. And so language access is one of the challenges that confronts us as we're reaching out to voters. One thing, since you asked me to reflect on the composition of our district, that's worth noting here, Washington is currently beating war drums. in two different directions at once, both with Ukraine and China. And I've spoken with Chinese American neighbors of mine who have reminded me how recent was the Japanese internment. And as a constitutional lawyer, I know too well that the case, Korematsu, which basically said that the internment was okay for constitutional purposes, despite applying the strictest standard of constitutional scrutiny, that case remains what lawyers call good law, even though it's like the worst law conceivable, because it's never been repudiated. And in the wake of the Supreme Court being stacked by right-wing ideologues, we should have absolutely no confidence in the ability or willingness of the courts to guard or defend civil liberties in a time of crisis. And so these neighbors of mine, Chinese Americans in San Francisco in 2022, are terrified that they're going to be detained with their families in military custody for no reason. And I wish that I could say to them that the law will protect you. It's what it was made for. We have courts to defend you from this. And if I could say that to them, I wouldn't need to run for office, frankly, because I could defer to the institutions to do their damn jobs. But it is precisely because they won't, and they haven't, and they're not poised to at a time of, frankly, likely predictable crisis. And I hesitate, and I fear the future, frankly. And it's why I'm running for office, because if we don't, again, chart some different courses, the fates, not just of my district here in San Francisco and my neighbors, but across the United States, and when we talked about the climate crisis, if nothing else, our problems are shared. Even if all politics are local, they are also ultimately inevitably global. And these challenges are ones that we share from California to Alabama. The need for universal health care and housing and food is no less acute in either of those places. And as wealthy and as white as San Francisco is, it's still a community of human beings who claim to have principles. And if San Francisco votes for our congressional representation in the way that our city has already voted in recent elections for the presidency, for instance, we know the votes are there. We just need San Franciscans to lean into possibility, reconsider their established tribal commitments, maybe look at the facts and make better choices. And that's exactly what I'm eager to work towards over the next 9 months.
You mentioned that that the demographics have shifted substantially in San Francisco lately, probably from the gentrification and similar forces. Can you talk a little bit though about how are racial minority and impoverished communities impacted by that? The ones that are still in the district, how does that gentrification impact their livelihood? And do you view there as like, is there some political energy there to be tapped into, I suppose, is what I'm trying to ask. Is the working class energetic about trying to get a progressive in to represent their district?
So many things to say there. Let's start first with the minority communities and we'll come back to the working class. So minority communities here have been, frankly, taking it on the chin for decades. The Fillmore was the site of one of San Francisco's Black communities a generation ago that was destroyed in an urban redevelopment project and process that destroyed a generation of Black wealth. It's Black History Month. People are learning in this year, finally, a little bit about the racism that has long pervaded our country's history. San Francisco's up to its neck in it. And when the Fillmore was destroyed, it did destroy a generation of Black wealth. And that problem continues today. So our last remaining Black neighborhood, Hunters Point, Bayview, is the site of a former U.S. Navy shipyard. The bombs that we dropped, the weapons of mass destruction that we detonated over civilian population centers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Marshall Islands 3 generations ago, those bombs were built at the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard. The ships that were used in the bombing tests in the South Pacific, when they were brought back to port and cleaned, they were cleaned at the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard. The land surrounding it is poisoned. It's now a Superfund site. It is so toxic that the housing developments, which have now been developed there are covenants that the owners have to sign not to grow vegetables because the vegetables are radioactive. And the role of our powerful voice in Congress, the Speaker of the House, represents that district. And all she's done for Hunters Point was engineer the land privatization deal that has exposed tens of thousands of people to radiation poisoning. It's one of the worst examples of environmental racism in the country. And it's in Nancy Pelosi's district. And it just astounds me when I hear people particularly say like, well, we can't remove Pelosi. She brings so much for the district. I'm like, say that to Hunters Point. What has she done for Hunters Point? Not a lot. And it's revealing who's benefits from the tenure of these long entrenched incumbents. Now, I want to get back to your question about the working class. The working class in San Francisco is also taking it on the chin. I think there's a challenge in both dimensions. For the minority communities, the reason there's less political valence there than I would hope is simply that they've been shredded so much, they're like pushed out of the city ultimately, so their voting strength is diminished. For the working class, the issue is political co-optation. Every labor union in San Francisco in 2020 endorsed Pelosi without any transparent process, even to their members. SEIU did this just last week. And a bunch of SEIU members who support our campaign were outraged. One of them wrote to us and said, I want to get you in this meeting where they're going to announce Pelosi's endorsement. So they didn't invite me, but the membership did. I show up. Of course, they don't let me speak. But while Pelosi's, grandstanding about her supposed commitment to the working class, I just posted a comment in the chat. And so the labor union leadership disabled the chat, and then they kicked me out of the meeting, and then they brought me back in. And these members are outraged because they should have a voice. And this is a crucial point to press on. There's a wave of labor workplace organizing and unionization happening across the country. I am very excited about it. And I do hope that it goes beyond that, because the movement for workplace democracy does not end in establishing collective bargaining units. They include holding collective bargaining units accountable to the rank and file, and the need for labor to democratize itself, particularly the rights of members and rank and file labor unionists to participate in the ways that their unions express themselves politically. Those are interests also that don't just coincide with my campaign. These are interests of the working class. And at the moment, I see the working class getting rolled both by Wall Street and even by their own supposed leaders. And this co-optation of the labor leadership by the corporate democratic machine is a big part of the problem. It's a big part of how Wall Street's been running us into a ditch for the last 30 years. And it's a big part of why I do hope that people can demonstrate the independence from institutions and tribes to examine independently their own interests and the facts, again, to enable better choices for our communities.
Is there enough of a group of labor in San Francisco to be able to oust Nancy? Is there enough to organize with?
Well, as long as labor is co-opted by her and won't even entertain alternatives, it doesn't frankly matter, right? In other words, at the moment, labor doesn't fight her at all. Labor is a crucial part of her constituency. She co-opts labor routinely. And
So
labor
what about
calls the shots. Ultimately, if labor chooses to demonstrate independence, they absolutely could put a different voice in place. But it is precisely the fact that not just SEIU, not just AFT, not just the building trades unions, not just the electrical workers, not just the dock workers, every labor union in this city endorsed a corporate incumbent who's been kicking their rank and file down the stairs for 30 years. And their rank and file deserve better than that. And this isn't about me. It's not about politics, like in the electoral sense. This is about community representation and the right of grassroots working class people to have a voice ultimately. And that's who I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for it both in the electoral arena, and I'm forced by the circumstance and the co-optation of the labor movement to fight for it within the labor movement as well.
What about the working class themselves? Are there enough of them in San
San
Francisco?
Francisco has been pretty hollowed out, right? We have a substantial community of white collar workers that are the preponderance of the city, but I don't want to overlook the fact that there are plenty of firefighters and teachers and laborers who still work in San Francisco and haven't been displaced. So while we have had very vicious gentrification in the city, I don't want to overplay the hand and pretend that we only have tech workers here and doctors, because that's not the case either. There's absolutely a working class in San Francisco that's been vitally underrepresented. Part of the question I think you're asking me, Ramona, I hear this come up in a couple questions, is, are there enough? And with all respect, I don't frankly care. I'm not here for my career. I'm here to advocate a set of principles, and we'll find out if they're enough. I've said often that we will get the democracy that we're willing to embrace, and I'm as eager as you are to find out if there are enough people in San Francisco aware of their own interests and conscious of the future and the past enough to enable the change that our communities in the future so desperately need.
So one thing that we really focus on at Real Progressives is the macroeconomics of everything. And I think that one thing that stifles progressive movements is the constant response from neoliberals and conservatives of how you're going to pay for it, where's the money going to come from? And
Right.
of course, they're conveniently hypocritical when they choose to care and when they choose not to. The situation in Ukraine would be a prime example currently. But I was hoping you could speak a little bit to how you might use your power in office to shift those narratives a little bit about deficit spending and some of the fear mongering that surrounds public deficits.
So I'm going to push this maybe in 3 different directions, and I'm definitely going to lose my place at some point. So feel free to remind me if I lose my train of thought. I'll first address sort of how to build the case for a more realistic vision of federal budgeting that acknowledges the opportunity to spend in the deficit to meet social needs. I also, though, want to press on a couple other dimensions that raises. So the first is the tension between military spending and domestic spending. Maybe I'll start there and I'll get to the second. And then there's also a component of this, and I knew I was going to do this. I already forgot what the third one was. Anyway, we'll come back to it. I'm sure it'll probably come up to me at some point between now and then. So let's start with the Pentagon versus domestic social needs. On the one hand, you're absolutely right that the federal government can print money at its whim. It's fiat currency. And at the same time that is true, when they tell us that we can't afford X, Y, or Z, like universal healthcare or climate justice, we know that that's false and built entirely on a misconstruction of how fiscal policy works and fiat currency. At the same time, I see the need to shrink the military budget as no less compelling by virtue of MMT as an escape valve budgetarily. So just want to put that on the floor at the sort of outset. Second, in terms of building the case for a more enlightened view of economics that acknowledges reality instead of this sort of propaganda we've all been told by the right wing and their corporate Democrat enablers, there's a couple pieces here. One is to propose visionary legislation that spends into the deficit, right? Oh, that was the third one. Reparations. My model for reparations it's an example of how to do that. Maybe we can pivot to that now if it's not too
100%. Please do.
Please do.
Okay. So a lot of people with respect to reparations are growing to recognize the depths of indefensibility of our country's history and the indefensibility of the current time slice economy, which has distributed resources on the backs of centuries of criminal history and mass. Now, 2 challenges emerge in the reparations debate. My proposal aims to sidestep them both. One is whatever the amount that we might debate of reparations will pale relative to the scale of the harm. That's the first issue. And from the other side of the fence, politically, we have a lot of people saying, well, if people were enslaved and suffered human rights abuses in the past, then why is it people only in the present being rewarded or, the windfall intergenerationally? And so the way around that, what I'd like to propose, and this would be an example of spending into the deficit, is a 400-year tax amnesty for Black families, tax filers, and Black-owned businesses, commensurate with the period of forced servitude. Now, just to be clear, when you compound interest as a tax amnesty does, the value of that reparations package would be vast. I dare say unquantifiable. It would dwarf any conceivable cash payment that anyone would realistically debate today. And it sidesteps the intergenerational argument because it distributes the benefits across the future instead of concentrating them at a single point in time. These are examples of the kinds of visionary proposals that spending into the deficit allows. We can do things like nationalize the fossil fuel industry by spending into the deficit to compensate those companies, get them off the table, take the profit motive away, and then we can make democratic decisions about how much we want to plunder the earth, or instead maybe pivot to better industries that don't do that, right? Those are questions that we should be making as a democratic society. They're not being made at the moment in that way because of the way we've constructed the property regime. But that's just a creature of policy. And maybe if I can dig in on that really quick, what sense has it ever made to allow people to sell things that they did not make and that they cannot replace?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we allow bundled into property ownership the right to sell whatever you can drag out of the ground underneath it. But that's absolutely senseless, especially in the day and age that we live in. And that's nothing more than a creation of property rights. And ultimately, that's state legislatures that are going to have to press there. But Congress can do things at the margin. And then these are crucial proposals that require the flexibility, the fiscal flexibility to borrow essentially within the federal budget. And that's what the Pentagon does relentlessly. I find this particularly interesting to have this conversation. The other thing I do in terms of making this case sharper is to highlight all of the examples, not only in which we've done this already, this demonstrated this awareness of budgetary principles with respect to the military industrial establishment, but all of the ways in which it has abused that privilege, right? Everything from relentless cost overruns. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter comes to mind. We're talking about a weapons platform that's already obsolete. It will cost over $2 trillion over its life cycle. That's the amount of student debt that Biden refuses to cancel, incidentally, just to like lay those, apples to apples. And this fighter plane can't even fly. One just crashed in the South Pacific and probably the South China Sea. Like, what is going on here, people? And I see so many Americans fear fascism as a far off future phenomenon, not recognizing that it is here. And if you have dark skin in the United States, you might recognize that it's been here for a long ass time. And I'm grateful that more Americans are coming to confront reality and grapple with it and overcome the cognitive dissonance that is enabled, to use Dr. King's words, the white moderate to escape accountability for its institutional deference for so long. And this is a current crucial moment in history to determine which way will the future break. Will we attempt to maintain the institutions of the past, which are already proven devastating to human life and communities? Or will we make better choices and recognizing the flexibility of our governments to meet the needs of our people, whatever the lines on the balance sheet look like, particularly when so many lines on the balance sheet are dedicated to destruction and misery with no conceivable useful purpose? It is all just a pretense by a corporate establishment to keep us from our needs and our rights. And ultimately, that's why I'm here, because power concedes nothing without a demand. I see the power of the corporate military industrial establishment arrayed against the needs of we the people of the United States. And that's why I'm eager to offer my neighbors a better choice, and grateful for the chance to connect with you today.
So how are you reaching your future constituents? Do you have a large volunteer base? Are you planning on knocking on doors? How are you going to go about bringing people in?
Yes to all of the above. Knocking on doors during the pandemic's a little complicated, so I'll be honest with you, the bulk of our outreach to voters directly has been over the phone. We're super active on social media. We're doing active house parties. You've seen the pathway that the members of the squad paved to Washington proved to sort of take root in communities introducing the candidate and the campaign to their respective networks. And that's how we built our campaign. We have a very active operation on the ground in terms of events and being present at movement events and organizing movement events. For instance, over the holidays, we organized a general assembly at Pelosi's office about congressional insider trading. And the people that were there included military veterans, students, families. We've done actions at Pelosi's house and office around issues from Medicare for All to climate justice. So that presence in communities that are already mobilizing has been a crucial part of the campaign. And the field program, which you're describing, knocking on doors, meeting people in their communities, that's all also coming. We've got 4 months before the primary election and 9 months before the general. I'll throw this on the table too. It was one particularly creative thing that we did in the last cycle. We haven't yet done this cycle, but we will soon, I hope. And that was take the show on the road. In addition to being a constitutional lawyer, I'm an MC and a DJ as well. And I'm fond of saying that house music brings us all together. And so we have a mobile art car that we use to basically get into the neighborhoods and share the message around the policy proposals, the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, doing it with a little music and flavor and reaching beyond the usual suspects to engage, young people, engage people who like to dance more than they might care about policy. And we've had some success reaching voters through all those different mechanisms. And we're going to leave no stone unturned over the next 9 months to make sure that everybody hears about the alternative that they have, even if the corporate media continues to white us out.
That is so, I love it when we are able to build community around a campaign. I think that is that's really cool, and it's an effective organizing tool as well. And just as a total random aside here, I did have the privilege just before COVID hit. I was in San Francisco volunteering for Bernie, and I met some of your wonderful volunteers who were kind of mingling with some of the Bernie volunteers in the Mission District. And you had a fantastic campaign going, and I really loved the energy coming from your volunteers. I'm hopeful that will repeat itself this cycle. And Shahid, before we call it a day, I was hoping you could just tell the audience what can they do to get involved with your campaign or help your campaign? Where can people find you on social media and get involved if they're interested in volunteering or donating?
Thank you, Luke, and thank you, Ramona. Folks can find us online at shahidforchange.us, or on any of the major social media networks at Shahid for Change. Ways to get involved: you can donate to the campaign, you can sign up to volunteer. There are any number of tracks that unleashes, everything from graphic design, social media amplifications, content administration opportunities on the website team, opportunities on the field team, introducing us to your network or helping other people set up events to do that. There's a million different options. I'll throw out one in particular. If any of your listeners are particularly frustrated with the media, we have a team that's training volunteers in how to influence media by leveraging social media and email as a communication medium. So if you're ever find yourself frustrated by the deference to Wall Street and the news that you consume, join us and let us train you how to help shift that. And we'd encourage you to use that both to help our campaign and whatever other campaigns are happening in your community. Thanks again for having me on. It's great to be with you guys.
Of course, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I want to encourage the audience. We've had Shahid's Twitter handle and website up throughout this interview. Make sure you're checking out his website and following him on Twitter, and we're also going to put those in the description box. Get involved if you possibly can. If you happen to be in the San Francisco area, make sure you're getting involved in Shahid's campaign. Shahid, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I really appreciate it.
Same to you. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Ramona. Keep up the great work.
Bye, Shahid. Thank you.